Hello, this is Scott Horton. I've just made the room live for people to start logging in. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome. As you're joining, you should be able to hear me and see the cover slide for the presentation, Reopening New York Part 1. I will be your presenter today. I will get started in just a couple of minutes after everyone has had a chance to log into the room. Thanks for joining us. You can access the chat function if you have any comments or questions or just want to say hello to let everybody know that that's working. While everyone's joining, I just want to note that you might want to make sure you have other apps on your device minimized or closed, preferably, so that it doesn't drag down the performance of the webinar, but hopefully you can hear me clearly and the slides will progress on your screen smoothly. Looks like some of you have access to chat. That's where people will be able to ask questions, which I will answer at the end, unless it really fits into what I'm saying. We'll get started officially in a couple of minutes as people are still joining, but just to let everyone know, I'm aiming for about a 1-hour presentation, but I will stay in the room to answer questions at the end within reason for as long as there are still questions coming in. I assume many of you can hear me, and that's why you are typing hello. Again, this is Scott Horton. I am the founder and attorney with Horton Law PLLC. We are based in Orchard Park, New York, just south of Buffalo. We have clients across the state of New York, including in the New York City metropolitan area, which is I'm only mentioning because it's somewhat relevant to some of the things we're going to talk about. Of course, those of you in that area know that you are behind upstate New York as far as opening, and I'm going to discuss how that's relevant to everybody involved throughout the state. So I'm just going to wait maybe 1 more minute to let a few more people get logged in, and then I will officially get started with the presentation. Okay, just a couple more seconds. I'm going to get started. People are still filtering into the room. All right, good afternoon. Again, this is Scott Horton. I'm with Horton Law PLLC in Orchard Park, New York. I represent businesses of all different kinds, for-profit, not-for-profit, public sector, private sector, in labor and employment law matters. And as you can all imagine, much of that lately has revolved around the coronavirus and COVID-19 and the business closings and employee leaves and furloughs and related matters that have come up from the disease. So it's been a very busy time, I'm sure for many of you as well. There's a dizzying amount of new information, regulations, guidance that all businesses need to be aware of to figure out in the first place whether they can be operating, and if so, what the limitations and restrictions are. A couple of notes about this presentation. Again, we're going to aim for about 1 hour. I will stay on beyond that to ask questions. If you have questions, ask them in chat. Just know that there is no attorney-client privilege in any questions and answers in this presentation. The presentation is for general informational purposes. If you need to have a confidential conversation with an attorney, then make sure you do that outside of this presentation. If I'm your attorney, then I'm happy to do that with you separately. But any questions you ask here, assume that they will be answered publicly, and we can't get into all the level of detail that I would or your attorney would if speaking to you about the best approach for your very specific circumstances. The slides for this presentation will also be made available at the end of the presentation. And if you have any questions about that at the end, we can address them at that point. I have given a series of a couple of webinars now that I know many of you have probably seen, addressing the coronavirus and related work issues. Those were broader than today's presentation in the sense that they weren't as specifically geared to a New York audience, and we were still largely guessing what many of the issues and regulations would be. Of course, we're constantly guessing at many things, so that part of it doesn't exactly change, but we are going to now focus on New York and the reopening plans and guidelines that the state is putting in place. I have titled this Reopening New York Part 1, assuming that we will have further webinars. I didn't call it Phase 1 because while that is where we are in most parts of the state in the reopening process, that the states or the regions of the state, as we'll discuss, will not necessarily all be on the same schedule. So I won't be necessarily presenting one phase at a time, but whatever the current circumstances are as we go into future webinars. So I'm calling this the unpaused stage, although for reasons I'll describe in a minute, that's not technically accurate. But the idea is we are now at the point where the state is allowing some non-essential, previously non-essential anyway, businesses to start to reopen. So all non-essential on-site work in the state of New York was put on pause on March 22nd through an executive order from Governor Cuomo. The latest approach to reopening in New York is a 4-phase reopening plan that began on May 15th for some parts of the state. While I said this is the unpause phase, or stage, to try to use different terms, the governor did issue a new executive order that has officially extended the pause order through May 28th. So essentially 2 weeks from when the initial pause ended. But the executive order now specifically allows for the exceptions for phase 1 businesses. The governor has indicated that 2 weeks is roughly the amount of time between phases, but that's not specifically set forth as a guarantee anywhere at this point. The governor has also indicated that that is flexible and could be less or more than 2 weeks, 2 weeks being the general guideline for how long it takes for the coronavirus to sort of play its course. And Governor Cuomo has said that what's important is not so much the 2 weeks, but having a sufficient amount of time to monitor the data to make sure they're not going back in the wrong direction. All that being said, the nature of the pause order being extended through May 28th, the reference to the 2-week period suggests that the regions that opened on May 15th or potentially other regions might hit phase 2 on or about May 29th. So we actually I already had a question come in. When do I think phase 2 will open? For the regions where phase 1 is currently underway, our best guess target right now is May 29th, but that is not fixed anywhere. Quick note that if your business was previously considered an essential business, the new 4-phase plan doesn't change that status, except that once your business would otherwise be allowed to open consistent with the 4 phases, it technically no longer relying on that essential business status as much as it is whatever the guidelines are in place at the time, at least in broad strokes. In other words, when phase 2, phase 3 opens, if your business, but for being deemed essential, would fall into one of those categories, you will now be required to look for guidance consistent with those phases and follow it. This may allow some expanded operations in the corresponding phases, or possibly more restrictive responsibilities, even based on the guidance that we've already seen coming out in phase 1, which is highly restrictive. Once there is guidance for your corresponding business, even if you were previously designated essential for other reasons, you will have to affirm compliance with the new relevant industry-specific guidance, which we'll be talking about in connection with the phase 1 industries. Most of you are pretty familiar with this concept by now, I'm sure, but New York's been divided in 10 regions for relevant purposes. The 10 regions are shown here. Most of the state now is in phase 1. Essentially, that encompasses all of upstate New York beyond what is here considered the Mid-Hudson Valley, the gray region. So Long Island, New York City, and the Mid-Hudson Valley are not yet in phase 1. The rest of the state is, with Western New York and the capital region coming online a few days after the other portions of upstate New York. Hopefully many of you have checked out the regional monitoring dashboard, which the state is updating roughly daily. Here's the URL on this slide to access this regional dashboard. This is what shows you the statistics that determine when a region could open for phase 1 in the first place. This is likewise the data that the state is monitoring to determine when to enter phase 2, and also potentially when it might be necessary even to roll back to a previous phase. Here's a slightly closer view. These are yesterday's numbers. The state has already updated today's dashboard, so these are slightly out of date already, but for the most part, nothing has changed. Long Island has still met 4 of the 7 metrics. The Mid-Hudson Valley has met 5, and New York has only met 4. I mean, based on these numbers, it's a really close call at this point, at least from anything we can tell here, as to whether Long Island, New York City, or Mid-Hudson will be the next to hit phase 1. New York City still has the most cases, but because they've been declining for over a month, their key metrics to watch are the share of hospital beds, including ICU beds. They're just under that 30% threshold. I think those numbers still hold for today. Long Island is also holding out on hospital beds, but they're almost there, and they also need a greater decline, as does the Mid-Hudson Valley, in the number of deaths. This Western New York number, because that's where we are located, and I know many of you are located in Western New York, I believe the 3-day rolling average went back down to 0 in today's numbers, so that's good news there. But again, everyone is watching these numbers statewide, and they are what dictates when we get to phase 1. As far as we know, there aren't different metrics that apply for getting to phase 2, and as long as you're still meeting the little green checks in all the 7 categories, you can move from phase 1 to phase 2. But again, that's not dictated in writing anywhere, so we will need to await further word from Governor Cuomo to confirm that. As many of you know, Governor Cuomo has had a press conference every day. He noted yesterday that it was the 80th consecutive day with such a press conference. He's already spoken today for his 81st day. I'm pretty sure I've seen at least 75 of those 81 press conferences. It's quite a task to try to keep up with all the moving parts. Normally he says something and then it gets put in writing a couple of days later, and you really need to wait and see what's in writing before you know exactly what his words mean. So it's constantly a moving target. I'm going to go through a number of slides now to just give you the basics of what are the industries and the different phases. And then once we speed through a bunch of slides, we're going to really focus on the requirements of the guidelines that are out now and concerns about what you need to do to be able to reopen, especially as concerns your employees. Real quick, I just want to go ahead and throw up a poll question. First poll here is your business currently eligible to be open in New York? Yes, no, or you don't know, you're not sure. And this means open on site in some capacity, even if limited. All businesses are able to work remotely if that's practical. So it's a fairly even split between yes and no. I've seen, in my experience, there are a large number of businesses that have met some qualification of being essential. And now with manufacturing open throughout most of the state, as well as curbside pickup for retail, these numbers are about what I would expect. Slightly more are open than not. Of course, we still have the big outlier in the New York City area where most businesses are not able to operate in person unless, of course, they really are essential. All right, so many of you have already seen this and it's all available on the state's website. The phase one businesses have been listed in some fair amount of detail. The general industries for phase one are construction, agriculture, retail, limited to curbside or in-store pickup or drop-off, manufacturing, and wholesale trade. The idea, of course, with phase one is these are supposed to be industries where people don't have to interchange with each other as much, and or they're outside. Landscaping has been separately opened more broadly throughout the state. So that's the big picture. Phase two businesses will be professional services, retail, more broadly, not just curbside, administrative support, real estate, rental, and leasing. This is a good point to note that the governor has pretty much conceded multiple times that these lists are not yet set in stone. So additional businesses may be added into phase two, phase three, phase four, possibly even moved between the stages. At this point, we believe things like beauty salons and barber shops will fall under professional services in phase two, or retail in phase two, somewhere in phase two, for example. That's the big question everybody has. But they've held out that they can add or change these along the way. But we expect this professional services to encompass a large number of office types of operations. Phase three businesses are primarily your restaurants. Specifically, it says restaurants and food service. Not entirely clear what the food service is, that it's not a restaurant, especially since things like grocery stores are already open as essential businesses. And then phase four is your arts, entertainment, recreation, and education. as recently as an hour or so ago, Governor Cuomo confirmed that there will be no on-site summer school at the public schools throughout New York. Of course, the schools were already previously closed through the academic year, so any summer school will also have to take place through distance learning remotely, but there's been no decision yet made on the fall. Again, it's not exactly clear that when this says education, then it necessarily means public schools, and that, for example, because they're not going to open now until at least September, that no arts, entertainment, or recreation won't be open until the end of September. But the idea being, these are the types of businesses where there are large numbers of people that typically come into immediate contact with each other. And while arts, entertainment, and recreation are listed in phase 4 businesses, it is possible that some of those types of activities would get placed in an earlier phase or otherwise accepted. We know Governor Cuomo has indicated that he would like to see the professional sports teams be able to get back on the field or ice or court, what have you, sooner rather than later, recognizing that probably means without any fans in attendance and subject to other restrictions. So again, if the Yankees decided that they can play in July and New York City hasn't reached phase 4 by July, it seems likely that there would be a carve out there. So let's get back to phase 1 because nobody is beyond that at this point. Obviously, I'm not going to read all these detailed subcategories, but just to let you know that the state has identified them within construction. These various components are included in phase 1. Similarly, for agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting, really not sure how much limitation there has been on fishing to the extent that it's producing a food source. Likewise, farms have been able to operate, but these activities that are related to that industry are included in phase 1, and hence there are guidelines now for those industries. Retail trade. There's been some retail that has been open as an essential service, and much of the retail business has been allowed to operate probably with delivery or curbside pickup already. But technically, most of those businesses were doing that with the limitation of having no more than one employee on site. Now, coming into phase 1, that type of on-site pickup is available for all the retail stores listed here. There might be something else that's arguably retail that's not listed here, in which case the state seems to suggest that it's not yet open, but I haven't come up with specific examples of that. The main point here is that now, instead of only having one employee in the store, you could have multiple employees, although there's still limitations. For example, the store has to maintain a maximum occupancy of half what the normal maximum occupancy of the store would be. In-store pickup is allowed, but it means the person has pre-ordered online or through the telephone and they're walking into the store to pick something up at, a table or a cashier or something like that without walking through the store. There's no in-store shopping available except where your store already qualified as an essential business. For example, because you sell groceries or other home maintenance supplies or whatever would have qualified as an essential business. Governor Cuomo has at least suggested that the in-store pickup is only an option when curbside pickup is not. However, I don't see that specifically in the guidelines, but obviously there are extensive restrictions, and in many cases you'd be better off not having people in your store if you don't have to, because of how restrictive the guidelines are and the risk that someone could transmit coronavirus one way or the other, an employee to your customer or vice versa, which wouldn't be good for many reasons, potentially including legal liability. Manufacturing, broadly defined as a phase one operation. Again, like all of these, there are restrictions in place, which we'll talk about, as well as wholesale trade, which is primarily going to include the businesses somewhere between the manufacturing facilities and the retail outlets. The middlemen are back in business. The state has created this business reopen lookup tool that actually seems to be pretty helpful so far. So here's the link to it, businessexpress.ny.gov/app/ny/. And I will show you what that looks like. This is what you literally get on the screen, is this button. You push this button, this blue button, and then it takes you to a two-step process where you first enter what county you're in, obviously relevant to determine which region you're in, as this notes if you have multiple locations across multiple parts of the state, then you need to check separately for each of those. Once you select your county, click next. You then enter your NAICS code. It tells you here to be as specific as you can about the type of operations that you're wondering about. Once you enter that, click next, you will get results. Just kind of randomly, I took the example selecting Erie County because that's where my office is, of an electronics store, which this tells you is currently permitted to operate with restrictions statewide. Restrictions that are applicable to your industry are as follows: delivery, curbside, and in-store pickup service only. So that's consistent with what we were just talking about. An electronics store qualifies as retail store for curbside, in-store pickup only. It goes on to give you the additional information. Click here to read applicable guidelines that you have to agree to, which we're going to talk about. Just to take another example, let's go back. I picked beauty salons, and this one kind of surprised me because I thought this was going to tell me, oh, sorry, you're not open yet. You'll note here, it does say your business is currently permitted to operate with restrictions statewide. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it turns out that means salon operations may continue to operate with respect to the takeout or delivery of products. No services may be performed. Obviously, that's a major caveat given the nature of the business, but I just thought it was at least helpful to point out how detailed some of these conclusions are from this app. So, it does note that, yes, you can still sell, hair care supplies for pickup, but you can't obviously cut or style hair. So type in your industry into this tool and see what it says. Maybe it will surprise you one way or the other in some cases. Okay, in addition to identifying which businesses are in which phases, New York has created 3 categories of reopening documents. These are called summary guidelines and detailed guidelines, as well as a safety plan template. Before I go into the details of the guidelines, I mean, they're industry specific, but they're very similar in most respects. There's definitely some industry specific information in some of them, but they follow similar general principles. I'm going to just try to show you an example of what the summary guidelines look like. If I can make this work, 1 second. So assuming this worked, you should now be seeing an example of the summary guidelines. This happens to be for curbside and in-store pickup. Make them a little bigger. So note that the summary guidelines here are 5 pages and relatively detailed, but here's the basic concept. There's a column for mandatory and then a column for recommended best practices. Most of the information is mandatory, but then there are some supporting best practices. So again, each of the industries currently in phase 1 has a document like this. At least the broad industries. There are some for some of the sub industries as well, but not each of them. Electronic stores don't have a different document from jewelry stores, for example. Okay, so that was just by way of example there. Okay, hopefully if that all worked right, we should be back on the slide that says New York reopening documents. So that was the summary document. There are also more detailed documents that are more like 10, 11 pages, depending on the industry. And they're less graphically organized and more just word after word after word after word, single space. So they're very long. What I'm going to try to do is basically summarize some of the key takeaways, but you're definitely going to have to look at the applicable guidelines for your industry. And if your industry is not currently in phase 1, you should go ahead and look at some of the guidelines documents for the other industries, because like I said, they're very similar across industries. So we anticipate that the phase 2 businesses will have similar document, just slightly specialized for the particular industry. The way all of these guidelines are organized is into 3 categories of people, places, and processes. It's a little awkward in places which items they put in the various categories, but the people section includes information about physical distancing requirements. Generally, the expectation is that people are going to be at least 6 feet away from each other whenever possible. Gatherings in enclosed spaces need to be very limited. If they do occur, there's conditions on how that has to happen. Restrictions on workplace activity, which basically include limiting interpersonal contact. Suggest, for example, staggering hours and shifts. And then movement and commerce, talking about specifying certain places where people are going to be to pick something up, or how they do that. Again, why that some of those items are in people instead of places, a little questionable, but you know, they had to put it somewhere, I suppose. Then we get into places, which include protective equipment, which seems to me maybe the requirement that people wear face masks might have been in people rather than places. But regardless, there is the requirement, key requirement, that businesses procure and provide face masks to all employees. There's latitude in what these face masks are. They can theoretically be homemade, although again, by the business itself somehow, or purchased. But they do have to be provided. And while the business has to provide the face mask, the employees can choose to wear their own face mask as an alternative, which is slightly annoying to me as a lawyer, because the one benefit to requiring the company to provide the face mask is that they have control over potentially or presumably the quality of the face mask. Where if somebody wears something from home, there's not much control over that, but that is what the guidance says. So you have to make sufficient quantities available. You have to provide them to each employee. You have to have extra on site in case somebody's face mask gets soiled or lost or what have you. There's also guidance in here that says that, I think it's in the processes section, but says essentially that employees need to be trained on how to wear the face mask and how to safely remove and discard them. So there's that. There's hygiene and cleaning expectations, including requirements that employers put up signs throughout the workplace reminding people to properly wash their hands at appropriate intervals before and after certain activities, as well as cleaning things like cash registers, computers, keyboards that multiple employees or even non-employees would touch. And there is guidance here about phased reopening, which is pretty short and straightforward. It just suggests that businesses not open to the maximum extent allowed all at once, but gradually start bringing people back in so that there's time to develop the right practices to keep everyone safe. Communication plans. The guidance here includes and reiterates a specific requirement that these long 9, 10, 11 page detailed guidelines for each industry at the end have a link to the PDF, which you can find each of these on the state's website. Obviously, there's a link at the end of the document to a form where you then enter the business name and contact information of the person filling it out, but you have to actually sign off on a statement saying that you have read the document and that the business will comply with it. That is technically a requirement to be able to quote unquote reopen. It is also a requirement of any business that was already open as an essential business once there is a guideline relevant to your industry in place. The communications plan also expects companies to do things like set up ways to communicate with their employees about any changes to requirements, expectations, procedures. They suggest using web pages, text and email groups, and social media for that type of function. And then we get into the processes category, which really comes down to meaning screening and testing and tracing and tracking. It's just me, but I found it's interesting when I was typing tracing and tracking, that the only difference in those two words is this extra K over here in tracking. But I digress. Also apologize, not intending to offend anyone with this cute little cartoon of a nurse, but you gotta have a little bit of fun with this difficult situation. If you have a sweet little nurse like this on site and employed in your business, then you might be able to do certain things screening wise that you otherwise wouldn't be so comfortable doing. But as a minimum, the state is clearly requiring every business that opens to, on a daily basis, have a questionnaire that asks the employees several questions about their exposure to coronavirus and their symptoms. We get into that in more detail. The tracing and tracking component of this basically says if you have an employee or customer or someone else who ends up testing positive for COVID-19, then your business has to cooperate with the health officials in tracing and tracking those cases. The exact extent to what that will entail is still somewhat unknown. So we're going to get back into that screening requirement in a fair amount of detail in a minute. I just want to summarize some of the notable components of these guidelines, but again, you're going to have to read them carefully. Ideally, the one specific to your industry, but if that is not yet available, check out some of the others because most of the components are going to be relatively similar. So again, there's mandatory health screening assessments before employees begin work each day. We'll go into more detail. Employees must maintain 6 feet proximity between each other unless safety or a core work function requires closer proximity. For most businesses, assume that means you shouldn't have people within 6 feet of each other. And if you do have to, they're going to need to wear masks. They're going to potentially need to wear gloves. You may need to have physical barriers between them to the extent possible. As far as a core work function, this might include somebody, in a delivery setting, handing something to another person, but there are recommendations that you have someone set something down and then someone else pick it up to avoid having to get within 6 feet. Or in manufacturing, there might be situations where the way assembly line has to be set up. People can't be within or further than 6 feet apart. There again, you might have to consider physical barriers between them, as long as that itself doesn't pose some separate safety risk. I've already mentioned you have to provide an acceptable face covering at no cost. I've had questions about, well, can we just give the employees money to buy their own? And I think the answer is pretty clear. There's a question and answer section on the state's website now, and one of the answers given specifically says that yes, the company must be the one that procures masks for their employees, provide them to their employees, and if you are not able to do that, then you're not able to reopen. There's also a question and answer that flat out says there are no waivers of any of these requirements. At this point, it's fair to conclude that reopening in New York is being treated as a privilege, not a right. And if you don't want to or cannot abide by the requirements, then from the state standpoint, you are not allowed to reopen, notwithstanding the nature of your business or the phase that your region is in. In-person gatherings must be limited as much as possible. This includes the ongoing recommendations that people work from home to the extent possible, and that meetings be avoided in favor of video or telephone conferences if that can occur. Again, you have to have signs throughout the worksite emphasizing proper hygiene, social distancing rules, appropriate use of PPE, cleaning and disinfecting protocols. I don't know if there's companies out there who have already started preparing and selling these types of signs, but I would guess that A, that has happened, and B, it will ramp up because the state says every business must post those types of signs throughout their worksite. From the state standpoint, I'm sure they're expecting employers to come up with their own signs so that they're specific to their workplace. How realistic of an expectation that is, I don't know, but I have not seen any template or model or example or printable signs from the state. Perhaps the CDC or some other agency out there has something like that that could be used. Here's another interesting requirement. Companies must maintain logs of all workers and visitors who might have close contact with each other or with other individuals at the site. So for employees coming into work, pretty much you should just expect to track who was there on a daily basis. For customers, you can't require that they provide their name or be tracked, but you can, encourage them that it's a good idea to assist with tracing and tracking if that becomes necessary. Obviously, hoping that it won't. There's also language in these guidelines that, the way I read it literally, says that employers must notify both the local health department and the New York State Department of Health if a worker tests positive for COVID-19 and assist with contact tracing efforts. That part of it, as I wrote it on this slide, I think is pretty clear and undisputable. The specific wording in the guidelines, however, basically, as I'm going to go into more detail on screening, suggests that if you even have an employee who reports having symptoms that might be COVID-19 symptoms, that you still have to contact the state and local health departments. I have a question into the Regional Control Board for Western New York to ask whether that is really the expectation. Just because someone has a cough, do you have to report it to the local health department? But as of the moment, I have not received an answer back on that. There is an email address set up for each of the 10 regions where you're supposed to send your questions about whether you're eligible to reopen or how to comply with any of the guidelines. So that is what I tried to do on that question that I have generally, and so far did not receive a response. So let's go into this screening, because this is going to be a real practical issue for all of you in New York trying to reopen and comply with these guidelines. The guidelines clearly require, at a minimum, a questionnaire daily of employees that suggest it could also include temperature checks, or possibly even, in some cases, a COVID-19 test. I don't think they really expect anybody to be giving a COVID-19 test daily, but maybe in a high exposure potential industry, healthcare, that might be prudent. But it does not appear that temperature checks are required, but it does appear to me that the type of questionnaire I'm going to talk more about would be required. Does say that screening personnel need to be properly trained. Exactly what that training is not clear, but I guess as a minimum it at least means reading the guidelines. And in-person screeners must wear face masks. Well, certainly if you're going to have somebody who is somehow administering a temperature check, and they probably have to get within close proximity to the person they're testing, face mask makes sense, consistent with other guidelines. If they're handing someone a questionnaire, I guess they also have to do this. I guess you don't have to have a written questionnaire. You could actually have someone just ask the questions. And likewise, if that's in person, they should be wearing a face mask. It doesn't have to be in person. You can do it remotely, whether through the internet, email, a phone call. And in fact, the state recommends that, because they don't want somebody getting all the way to work and potentially exposing somebody if they could just be questioned at home and then determine that they don't need to show up. As far regarding this questionnaire, these are the 3 questions that need to be asked. Have you knowingly been in close or proximate contact in the past 14 days with anyone who has tested positive for COVID-19 or who has had symptoms of COVID-19? Have you tested positive for COVID-19 in the past 14 days? And have you experienced any symptoms of COVID-19 in the past 14 days? So on a daily basis, all employees have to be asked these questions before they can start work. You can't make customers or other visitors do this in most cases, but you can certainly encourage them to answer these questions or to not enter if they have say yes to any of these. The trickiest part here, I mean, have you tested positive or not? That's one thing, but the symptoms issue, from CDC guidelines, here are the currently identified symptoms of COVID-19. Fever, cough, shortness of breath, each of those is considered a symptom. And then this final category, if you have two of them, that's together considered having COVID-19 symptoms. Fever is repeated again, which really I think is irrelevant. If you have the fever, it doesn't matter if you have another one of these because fever alone is a COVID-19 symptom the way this is set up. So it's really two of the following: chills, repeated shaking with chills, which again, those two you couldn't have together, so a little complicated. Muscle pain, headache, sore throat, or new loss of taste or smell. In other words, if you just have sore throat, that doesn't necessarily qualify as having COVID-19 symptoms. But if you have sore throat and headache, or if you have chills and muscle pain, then you're considered to have COVID-19 symptoms. All right, so you ask these questions and get some answers. Now what do you have to do about it? If yes to the symptoms or testing positive, then you can't work on site and should contact. So the employee can't work on site and they should be really, the employer has. Can anyone hear me? I have somebody say they can't hear sound. Somebody type in chat if you can hear me. Okay. It sounds, I think it's all working. So if you can't hear me, yeah, you can all stop. I get the picture. Thank you very much though. So yeah, I apologize if you can't hear me. Check your own system because it seems to be working. So it says the employee can't be allowed to work and they need to be directed to contact their health provider. Can't make them contact their health provider, but you have to tell them that they should. The employer then, like I was saying before, apparently has to immediately notify the local health department and New York State Department of Health about the suspected case. Again, just because you have a fever, are you a suspected case? And does the employer have to contact the Department of Health? At the moment, that's the way I read the guidelines. It seems to me quite likely that the Department of Health is going to get inundated with contacts about this, especially as we're in allergy season. People are going to say, well, yeah, I did have a headache 10 days ago, and today I have a sore throat. And there's not any sort of guidelines or clarity as to what you're supposed to do as to try to pin down on those symptoms. It seems like just if they say, yes, I've had those symptoms in the last 14 days, then you have to follow this protocol. Hopefully there'll be some information coming or frequently asked question responded to along these lines soon. And then the employer should also provide the employee with information on healthcare and testing resources, which presumably can be obtained through your local health department or the CDC. Various state and federal resources will probably tell you who you can contact, but the state doesn't tell you yet exactly what that means. Here's a couple other categories broken down. If an employee reports symptoms and it's then tested positive or doesn't get a test, they have to then go through a 14-day self-quarantine before they can return to work. They might be able to work remotely if that's possible and available, or they can't come on site. unless they're critical to the operations or safety of the facility, in which case the employer has to consult the local health department before a possible return with additional precautions. Again, I just don't understand how the local health departments are going to have the capacity to deal with all these potential cases. Hopefully there won't be many potential cases, but if we're going off of just one or two of these symptoms, which likely could relate to other conditions as well, I just have some concerns about the practicality and feasibility of all this. But if there is a positive test, then basically exactly the same thing. Positive test, that is, even without symptoms, still a 14-day self-quarantine unless critical, and then you have to consult with the health department. If there are no symptoms and the only yes was to having close contact with somebody with COVID-19 in the last 14 days, there are separate guidelines that says you have to make the employee have regular monitoring, which might mean taking temperature periodically throughout the shift. The employee would then be required to wear a mask at all times while in the workplace for 14 days after their last exposure to someone who tested positive for COVID-19. They're expected to social distance at all times, and it doesn't say who's supposed to do this, but there's supposed to be additional disinfecting of cleaning and cleaning of workspaces that this person comes into contact with. And then if at any point in time symptoms do arise, then they fall back into one of those previous categories and have to have a 14-day quarantine. All right, the last issue, we're coming up on our hour, but if you have any questions, you could certainly start putting them in. We're going to wrap up with a couple of quick items. Safety plans, which isn't going to be a quick item on your end, but let me show you the state's template safety plan document. Scroll back to the top. So this is a document. This is not industry specific. This is a general template that the state has created. You will be required to post a written safety plan conspicuously in the workplace, whatever that is going to mean. You don't have to use this template document, but they provide it to make it relatively easy. This follows the same general model of the guidelines. The idea is you put in the relevant information, check off these boxes, and then there are blanks to fill in more information. This is a fillable PDF document, but obviously you could cut and paste and make a separate format if you wanted to. Depending on your circumstances, I'd probably have different recommendations. If you're a relatively small business with fewer employees, probably better just to use the state document and fill it in so that you know you're following everything they want you to agree that you're following. If, on the other hand, you have larger and more complex operations, then it might make sense to have a separate plan. You just need to make sure that it encompasses all the areas that the guidelines require. So again, they really expect you to go through this and think about your specific work site. Clearly, multiple work sites could have separate plans, or you could have the same plan across work sites. So that is what that looks like. All right, back over to our slides to wrap this up. You don't have to submit this plan to the government, but they have been quite clear in noting that one of the purposes of having you complete this plan is that if the state or local government has to come in for any reason, they will ask for your written plan. And then if you haven't followed what you agreed to follow, they will likely hold that against you. You do still have to submit that affirmation of following the guidelines on site, but you don't have to separately submit your individualized safety plans. Any essential businesses that are currently open, even if there's not yet industry specific guidelines, do have to create a safety plan template. So you should go through that process immediately if you are already open as an essential business, and you may need to change your safety plan at some point in the future if there are guidelines that come out that are more applicable to the nature of your current operations. Just to wrap it up here, and then we'll do the question and answers. I'll get you the copy of the slides. Expect changes. The guidelines all warn that they might change. They specifically say if there are newer guidelines from the state, then you have to comply with whatever the most recent guidelines are. At this point, everything seems to be changing, so I would expect that's a realistic possibility. The transition between the stages or phases of all of this is uncertain. There are ad hoc exceptions. Drive-in movie theaters have been allowed to open, even though seemingly they might not come into play until phase 4, where obviously, traditional sit-down inside movie theaters are not open and probably won't be for a while. Going backward is certainly a possibility if the numbers start to turn in the wrong direction on a region by region basis. Or possibly the science changes in some way, then either restrictions could ramp up or certain industries could be closed back down. And it is possible that the federal government could step in. Obviously, any requirements that they impose, to the extent they have authority to do it, would trump the state guidelines. I don't know whether that was an intended pun or not. Likewise, an or not is whether the government is just going to maintain its hands-off approach all the way up to the extreme of not providing any state aid, which, as Governor Cuomo has emphasized many, many times now, would be crippling to New York State, which will have other ramifications for everyone who has a business in New York State going forward, but it's too early to be sure what is going to happen there and how that might affect you directly. With all that being said, obviously you want to stay updated on this. We're doing our best. We have a monthly email newsletter that'll be coming out next week. And if you want to sign up for that, if you register for the webinar, we will add you to that newsletter. You can always unsubscribe if you're not interested in getting it. But if you're watching this later somehow or want to share this with anyone else, they can sign up on our website to get that. The best way to get the most recent information we have to share is through our LinkedIn page, Horton Law on LinkedIn. I'm now going to take the questions. I think there was one or two already submitted. If you have any more, please go ahead and start typing them in while I first give everyone the access to the slides so you can take those for future reference. So you should have now or in a minute a link to get the webinar slides. You will also get an email tomorrow that will give you a link to the slides, and at some point you will also have access to watch this again if you missed any portions or you want to share it with a colleague, what have you. Again, recognizing if you watch this in a week, some or all of what I just said might be out of date. And keep entering any questions if you have them. If you remember, it's not a privileged conversation. Don't get too specific. But if you do have questions you want to ask more specifically, here's all my contact information. you could reach out. I'd be happy to try to help you out with these very complicated and difficult times. I had a question earlier I'll go ahead and answer that said, is there legal liability for a company that is a non-essential business but has employees going into the physical office? So if you are a non-essential business, then your office really shouldn't be open unless you're in phase one. But if you're a non-essential business, not in phase one, you are allowed to have an employee go into the office for routine things like to check the mail as often as every day, or something that has to be done daily for a short amount of time or periodically for a short amount of time. But really, and that should always only be one employee, which should limit exposure. Otherwise, the general question of legal liability is there's the potential for legal liability underlying all of this. All of these new guidelines just create considerable new duties for employers, and there is the extensive risk that anything that's not done to satisfy all of these guidelines could be used against the company in a claim, either by an employee or by an outside party, if they were to contract coronavirus in the workplace or in your business facilities. There's nothing per se stopping that liability for the most part at this point. There might be some limitations in very specific industries, mostly including healthcare related industries. But yeah, I mean, I will say I tried not to be too pessimistic and just present the facts through most of this presentation. But my general sense is I would not be a business that's just going to open automatically because the state has said I can. It is a serious cost benefit analysis. One, it's going to be very costly and time consuming to comply properly with all of these new requirements. Two, customer demand may not be the same as it was, and that factors into, is it worth the cost? And then three, whether you meet the guidelines or not, you could have claims. They might be workers' comp claims from employees. You might have various leave issues to deal with, whether you tell people they can or can't work, and whether they want to work or not, whether they're getting unemployment now and prefer to stay that way. You have to expect there's going to be headaches. Again, the way the state's looking at this point is, for most businesses, especially non-essential businesses, operating is a privilege and not a right at this juncture. That we really can't say who will win those cases because it's so unprecedented. Those cases haven't been heard yet. Yeah, there's a good question here. As an essential business that has remained open, are the daily questionnaires required of in-office staff? There's a slight gap in the guidance on that, I think, because you do have to have a safety plan now as an essential business. And the safety plan definitely describes the mandatory health screening, but there are not necessarily industry specific guidelines for your industry if you're an essential business yet. But I would say if I were you and I had employees on site, then yes, I would begin the daily questionnaires regardless of what industry you are currently in. But I mean, I could make an argument against that, but I'm not sure it's worth the argument because, if nothing else, the state has identified that this is the best practice. If you don't follow it and then someone contracts COVID-19 in your workplaces, it's probably not going to look good at the very least. So very good question. Yeah, some of those essential businesses are in a tricky spot because you don't have these specific guidelines, but it certainly appears the state has a core set of basic procedures and expectations that they want any businesses operating in person to abide by. But you don't have to, as far as I know, affirm compliance with any of the guidelines to the state yet until your industry specific guidelines come up with the relevant phase that they're going to be identified in. A lot of the businesses that are open now as essential outside of the healthcare industry are going to come up into phase two. I mean, healthcare as professional services probably will come up in phase two as well, frankly. So, you know, if it's not something that's specifically identified in 3 or 4, which is primarily restaurants and arts and entertainment, then the current expectation is you're likely to be included in phase two, keeping in mind that reopening in all these phases means still limited people in the workplace for the most part. It's highly unlikely that many businesses of any meaningful number of employees, I don't know what that means, 10, 15, 20, something like that, are going to just bring everybody back into the workplace at once and be able to comply with the guidelines. Might happen, but for the most part, not really what the guidelines envision. Another question on essential businesses. People that have been working from home, are you to make them take a COVID test prior to return? There's no requirement that you make anyone take a COVID test. It's not even clear that you can make anyone take a COVID test. I mean, that's a complicated, different question that might have other disability accommodation issues involved in that type of thing, possibly even religious accommodation issues. So we try to avoid that. But no, I don't see anything that says you have to make them take a test. You have to at least ask them the questions whether they've had symptoms. If they have had the symptoms, you have to send them home and refer them to their doctor, and let them discuss with their doctor whether they're going to take it. You can't make them self-quarantine. You can't lock the door of their house and not let them leave. So I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work. Again, it seems to be the case you're supposed to notify the local health department, making people take COVID tests. And again, if you're going to do that, I would make sure you talk to counsel before you decide in your specific case whether to do it or not. Just going to give another minute or two to see if anybody has any more questions. Like I said, I'm happy to stay on and answer them. Glad we were able to keep this pretty close to an hour, at least as far as the prepared material. If you do have another question and don't have time to finish typing it, just type what you have and then click enter so I know that there's a question coming. I'll be happy to wait. Otherwise, I certainly appreciate all of your time and interest and wish you the best of luck in managing this crisis. Like I said, I anticipate we'll have more webinars as the next phase opens or more guidance comes out. I don't know if phase two is starting next Friday. We probably won't have another webinar by then, but probably at some point in June, we will have another webinar to address the state of things at that point. But if there's enough development, then we could change that. All right, not seeing any more questions. I am going to go ahead and sign off. If you have questions later, you can contact me at the information on the screen and we'll see what we can do to help you out at that point. Thank you all for your time. Have a nice day and stay safe.